Okay, so we're not blurry today, I hope. At least not for an extended period of time again, like last time. I guess I'll start with this. I'm not putting this particular episode in the Bookworm playlists. This is more geared just toward the movie people. But of course, if you're looking through my screenwriting stuff playlists, of course, there's a whole bunch that I just did that are all slightly more geared toward prose fiction, novel writing, and whatnot, but is still mostly applicable knowledge here. So you can go and watch those at your convenience if you are interested in the topics about, dialogue and good and bad endings and all that kind of thing. Some of this I talked about already. I forget if it was episode 19, but maybe more likely 21. But I don't think it's too redundant that it's going to be too bad of a hindrance. Some of it is it was kind of hard to capture everything in the title. So it's not only about just one thing, it's in three parts. And so the first part, we're going to be talking not just about adaptation, but all that stuff I mentioned in the description about scenes and sequences and stuff, but also in relation to just basic story beats, which in a screenplay and a novel, we're kind of dealing with similar issues, I guess, or strategies. In a script, we're a little bit more typically limited in our scope. A novel, usually going to be around a certain number of pages, but not limited to that number of pages. A movie, kind of the same thing. Are you writing an epic or are you writing a standard rom-com? But if you're writing a standard rom-com and it's 3 hours long, chances are it's never going to get made, right? So we know we're dealing with 120 pages almost automatically. And we know that like in the 80s, it's more like 90 pages, or you started with 120 pages and so much of it got cut to make the movie 90 minutes. Excuse me. As soon as I start filming, I always get a frog in my throat. I don't know why. So I'm sorry. But so yeah, chapters and scenes, this was kind of a thing that I was encountering watching other videos about prose writing. Is they would use the term scene more often than the term chapter, because a chapter can contain multiple scenes, whereas in a screenplay we don't have chapters. But if we're adapting from a novel, they might have chapters that might not coincide with all of our scenes. Again, the chapter might have multiple scenes, or it might be a brief cut of something that might be part of a longer scene, that kind of thing. So we weren't going to get too hung up on that, actually. That was just, a starting point more than the end all be all of what we're trying to do. Now, in the more famous book, some other authors have tried to redefine the terms scenes and sequence, but I'm using that terminology, that multiple scenes that are related to each other make up a sequence. Sometimes you'll have things from this part that show up again later or whatever, and they're not technically part of the same sequence, even though they're thematically related. That's just an aspect of storytelling. But an actual sequence, is an actual kind of piece of work, and then you might have like a little transitional thing or whatever, and then you might have another one, and however many of those you string together to make an act, again, in a screenplay fits into the confines of those 3 acts, or technically 4 parts, because you have the second act most people consider the midpoint. So why is this not act 2 and act 3 and then act 4 instead of 1, 2 and a long one with a middle. However you want to kind of face it, you're still writing 2 different distinct chunks if you're using a midpoint in your structure to hinge the beginning and the end of your film, right? So yes, there's no specific number or length of each, but we're fitting in the parameters of the plot points. The plot points, of course, being what sends us into Act 2 and Act 3 or 4, however you want to number that, in our story structure. So typically, like I said, this is timed in film, not in literature. We got 30 minutes of pages, or 30 minutes of screen. 30 pages is 30 minutes of screen time. Most movies, according to at least one guy, is 60 to 90 scenes. Comedy less, action more overall. And then the more scenes, the more story beats, and the less character beats was their kind of advice. We'll discuss that a little bit more in a minute. And then vice versa, the kind of more of a rule of thumb than a requirement. We'll get into that in a minute too. So now the pros talk in terms of these beats, but they don't also specify what the length of a beat might be. Is 30 seconds enough? Longer? Shorter? I think they're just trying to sound technical or trying to put it in a dramatic context because actors talk about their beats, but I'm not sure that actors' beats are the same thing as film beats because actors are thinking on an emotional level that may or may not have to do with the character arc at all, blah, 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 blah. I know it gets confusing. That's why I don't really think about these things while I'm doing it, especially the first draft, okay? And we'll get into outlining in a minute, which also didn't make it into the title headline. So, yeah, I don't know if there's better words, longer and shorter, than more and less, because more and less is kind of vague. Like, does more mean they're all shorter or more that are the same length? Again, vagueness. But typically your beats are related to your story arc or your character arc. How many beats make a scene or a sequence? They don't say. This is something you have to, kind of navigate and negotiate and learn with time, right? And how your story is going to go, the pacing might be totally different than a different story. Again, an action story might have a lot faster pacing than a dramatic story where the scenes can be longer and therefore the beats might feel longer or whatever. Most typically adhere to more conventions than, must. Does that say must? Yes, you must typically, not most, well, most of you must typically adhere to more conversations than fiction prose writers overall, because again, you don't have all that room to go sprawling and throw in all this extra description and stuff. But this frees us up slightly from trying to reinvent the wheel, I guess. If nothing else, there's always that. Take heart, the screenplay format being this kind of, train track thing that actually helps us guide how long these things need to be and where we need to add more or subtract some or, find a way to move this over if we don't want to lose it completely. I had talked about in the video yesterday, I think, about how sometimes I'm writing a thing and I don't know if it's going to go into Act 1 or Act 2, or maybe that's in my notes here later. I don't know. So, but I don't always come into a thing with having no scenes kind of in mind. But again, the story beats versus the character beats, this kind of relates a little bit more to, most of these people will tell you that when you're doing a screenplay, especially even more than a novel, that you can't really pants it. You must have an outline. And one guy says you're going to have to at least have about 5 pages instead of, only 3 or a full page. But he also says he likes to start with a screenwriting formatter software, and that helps him do the outlining on the fly kind of more. I do that to a degree, but I usually plot some out on paper first. Just because I don't use screenwriting software, at least not for the first draft, because you can always import the thing in later, and especially if I'm doing an adaptation. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Let's talk about the outline briefly first. So step one in their guide, again, basically what I pretty much kind of do. One, get all the beats down prior to writing. I don't get all of them down prior to writing, but I get the big ones, those main scenes. And then, like I said, if I have to throw in kind of extra stuff later, then it's not stuff that I'm thinking about now when I'm thinking of the story. And it makes it a little bit harder to work that way, maybe a little bit, because I'm trying to add things that aren't just fluff. But if I have 3/4 of the story done, then it's not a full 120 pages, but it's still 80, 90 pages, which again, in the 80s is a screenplay length. So I'm, as long as I'm kind of there in a couple of weeks or whatever, I'm relatively happy, although I'm not calling it a finished first draft yet. But here we are trying to bring beats to life, even if we change them later, or change the actions rather somewhat later, what happens in the scene itself. We're still accomplishing the same goal for the scene in a better way overall. So he's saying, have your character beats more or less kind of fleshed out, but your story beats totally more or less even more so. So the story is, basically your building blocks needed to get the story from the beginning to the ending, your plot points, your midpoint, your climax, which beats per scene to include from the outline to the draft. Like I said, I typically do work this way instead of note cards. I don't really bother with the note cards. Because why am I spending all this time trying to organize the thing when I can just do that with a Word document? It's in slug words. I'm just moving stuff up and down rather than arranging them on a wall, which are just the same slug words, bar, night. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. You have to know which bar, because there might be multiple bars or office locations or the forest or tropical beach, whatever. That's vague, right? Tropical beach day. Okay, I can put up 60 of those on a wall. And that doesn't help me arrange them all that much. So I don't really work that way. Some of you might love the note cards, fine. But you'll never convince me that I'm going back to that anytime soon. I just, formatting and writing scene blurbs in some logical order, but not always sure if they will be act 1 or act 2. Oh, here we go. Okay. Until I get farther along and think of other ideas for scenes that may make better beats in terms of showing rather than telling, right? So the character that you need the transformation goes through during the story, their arc, can be less linear than story beats. Okay, so that's their advice, and my advice kind of mixed together, I think. We'll talk about character a little bit more later. I won't go into that now. Gains and losses more or less tied to the story beats. This can happen in the same scene as a story beat, and typically probably does, and you're probably doing that naturally without overthinking it or thinking about it. Still must be unpredictable and entertaining story. Gains and losses, right? Pick a loss that makes the most sense out of the multiple losses was his example. So sure, house, job, wife. Obviously, losing your wife should be more of a beat than losing even your job. Although most people don't lose their house unless they lose their wife in a typical scenario. Unless the husband and the wife lose the house together in like a tornado or something, and then she decides that the tornado is his fault and leaves him. So I don't understand exactly what scenario that was. That could possibly make sense, but not really that important. It's just, again, going back to the video, one or two ago about raising the stakes. Is it a high stakes moment or is it a low stakes moment? How high a stakes a moment is how more likely it is to coincide with the plot points. Because your life is not going to totally change direction just because you lost your job, but it's more likely to change direction because you lost your job than they didn't have the chocolate donut you wanted at the 7-Eleven or whatever, right? So yes, losing your wife might be a bigger deal than losing your job. So you might lose your job at page 8, but then not lose your wife until page 10. Then all of us, or sorry, let's move those along. Let's say page 25 and page 30. Then all of a sudden we're in act 2 because my wife is gone. What am I going to do? Whereas when he lost his job, he was just like, oh, I'm just going to tell my wife I lost my job and we'll figure it out and da-da-da. And then all of a sudden the wife was like, no, you lost your job. You're a loser. Okay. So there, illustrated that for you. Which, of course, still has nothing to do with novel adaptation. But if you're just getting into storytelling, these are the things that the preamble covers, right? Okay. And we're almost done with this part. So they can interact, but typically more story than character, especially action movie where maybe few character beats at all, limited arc. And yes, this is what I was just talking about a minute ago. Or like a character like James Bond, where there is no arc, or at least in the old James Bond movies, when there's like 3 different actors, but he's basically the same guy from movie to movie. Whereas the new Bond is a little more touchy-feely and vulnerable, and he loses his spouse or love interest or something, and so he's a bit more like the Jason Bourne action movies. But audiences were still okay with the change, I guess, or I don't know. But yeah, traditionally that's not James Bond. James Bond loses his love interest every single time, and the next movie has a brand new one. So it's not a thing. They want to bring in a new gal every time. That was the whole point, was the new Bond girl. Whatever. Or not the whole point, but you know what I'm saying. Superman, again, not really a character who has much story arc. He's always Superman. Now, in the comics and the TV versions, he's more solid that way. In the 80s movies, he turned evil for an episode, or he became mortal for an episode, that kind of thing. So there was a bit of a character arc there before Superman became Superman again and saved the day, right? Okay. Nevertheless, okay, most of your heroes and villains aren't going to be that set in stone, and hence your character beats that relate to your character arc. Outline step 2, how many characters in each scene, character beat, then whom is required for each scene for these beats to take place. Is maybe all the characters aren't having arc beats, but they're causing what might, make your protagonist or whoever have their big change. So you should know this in your outline if possible, so you can have all their motivations and things kind of worked out in advance. Again, if you're a pantser, which is more of a novel type of term, you may not want to go that deep because you might want your characters to be a little more fluid. But what's happening to your main character or your main antagonist or whatever, that you still should kind of know where that's going at this point. So that will be a little more relevant. But character beat, then whom required, then some other fluff scenes and transition things and things for pacing might be added, that you, again, may or may not outline all of those, but you kind of know where they might need to go. It's helpful to put in the outline beforehand so they don't get skipped when the big things comes down, but then again, they can always be kind of changed later. But then you must also have the characters present in some way rather than, in your main scene. Again, your transitional scenes, you might not be worried as much about which characters are where or whatever. But in your main scene, the characters don't all have to be present in the exact place, but they still have to be like on the phone or something so that they're in the scene, even if they're not in the location. And so I don't know if you'll always know that in the outline, but if you do have stray characters and you're trying to figure out how you're going to work them in, this would be a good time and, strategy to figure that out so that you're not, wait a minute, what am I going to do with this guy? How is, later. So you're not just trying to fix everything constantly rather than just writing, I guess. And then who gets to speak or affect the action? Yeah, again, which are the minor players and which are the major players? Why is this minor player becoming a major or more involved player for this particular scene? Are they a linchpin, some kind of key? Whereas before they didn't even talk. They just sat at the bar looking kind of grumpy, and now all of a sudden he's the king of Middle Earth. Okay, sure. It can happen. Okay, so step 3 in your outline, what does the character, again, I kind of said this in motivations, what does each character want? You don't have to know all of this, but again, you should have a pretty good idea about your primary characters more than your secondary characters. They get it or they don't. This is leading to their desires. What, the writing teachers always say, what is your character desire above all? And their desires can change, not just from, one part of the story, but from 1 minute to the next, their desires may change, right? But just because they desire something doesn't mean they automatically get it. And usually when they don't and they get stymied is when we have that dramatic tension. And so, yes, that dramatic tension we want in our outline as much as possible before we start writing, or we have a very flat, no conflict story. Okay. Story versus character beat. But again, we're not necessarily thinking about all these up and down of it. We're just, again, what is their motivations? What are their pitfalls and, brick walls and that kind of thing. In a nutshell, these, like I said, these things can intertwine, and we don't have to automatically plot them all out exactly because we can change things. There might be a better scene later where it's better to have this character arc take place than having it in Act 1. Oh, well, if he does this, then it kind of solves the whole movie, and now the movie's kind of over and there's all this other junk that's happening for no reason. So let's move that to later and make it a bigger, higher stakes event, right? Step 4, give each character action. What are they all doing? Why are they in this scene again? Are they just sitting there looking grumpy? That's fine if they're, doing that for a reason, but this is a typical thing to discuss, again, more to deal with how actors react to the material than like novel characters where the example given was, they just sit and talk. I don't know a lot of novels where characters just sit and talk either, but certainly to a greater extent, that's less dull than a movie where we want to see stuff going on. We want to see motion and movement and that kind of thing. Okay, so that was kind of a long part that had something to do with stuff. So now we enter part two. And yes, this will be a pretty long video and not entirely comprehensive, but here's how it goes. Now, as I was discussing in the previous video, if I was your actual instructor, and you weren't just watching this for guidelines, I guess, more than me having an actual course load for you to do, I would likely be tempted to issue you books for adaptation that would be nearly impossible to adapt for one reason or another, and maybe tell you not even to use an outline. But this was what I was going to say at the beginning. There's 2 ways that you could maybe adapt a book into a script. The first way would be to literally retype the whole thing as prose and then just start making your cuts and changes. I don't think most people would work that way. I think it would be very hard for me to convince somebody to even not do these basic outline things first, because I can't be in the room with them, forcing them to do it my way, and trying to do it on the fly, as it were. But yeah, just to drive you crazy a little bit at first and see how dedicated you are, put you through these paces. But also, to see if, an aspiring writer could work around certain problems, or if they would just revert to, voiceover to try and solve everything that can't be easily conveyed visually. As I've said, I think maybe I've said this before already in a previous, And I don't, I just don't recall what I say in all my videos because I don't go back and rewatch all of them before I make a new one. There are some cases where voiceover works very well or is effective enough or is possibly even completely necessary, but they should also be considered a last resort, at least according to some sources. And so when you take a book that's very wordy, especially one written in first person, like Huckleberry Finn or Catcher in the Rye or whatever, On the Road, most of these have not been adapted very well to Huckleberry Finn, maybe more effectively than the other two. Catcher in the Rye, they keep trying to adapt the thing and they keep failing, and all the literary geeks are like, "Thank you, at least one thing, still sacred or whatever." On the Road, they finally made it into a more or less movie. Discuss. Yeah, I mentioned before that I may have had a couple victims in mind for this experiment, but they refused to accept the challenge, and so I don't know what results they would have produced. And I have more than enough other ideas to work on than torture myself trying to adapt things that are never going to become movies. But they might not be the worst exercises to attempt as a personal challenge someday. And so I'll let you know if I go through with it, and maybe, like I said, maybe you should want to attempt some of these before you attempt your own first official screenplay. For now, I'm more focused on prose instead of script writing because it takes a lot longer and it's a lot more involved. And I'm already pretty good at adapting the thing to the thing. So there's that. But coming back to the screenwriting software and the whole adaptation process, I think I said this already, like I said in the previous, the easy joy of just deleting words and adding spaces when making a screenplay, especially when adapting from prose, is much more it's much more pleasant going to a screenplay format than going to a book format trying to novelize a script. That's more demanding and tedious when you're going back the other way for most writers. I think the novelization process makes sense for some writers because they already have the character descriptions and the plot points and all that kind of laid out for them in advance, and they just have to fill in story and backstory, exposition, and that kind of thing. But someone who just wants to be a screenwriter will likely find the prospect of such a project too time consuming and draining when they could just be working on the next script, right? Perhaps it should be attempted at least once so you can, realize there are slightly somewhat different skills writing the novel versus writing the screenplay. And so also gain new or regain renewed respect for the novelist, etc. But when we are adapting the novel, of course, most of those things are an annoyance because, like I said, it doesn't add up. A lot of the stuff that novelists do doesn't make for good screenwriting. Untangling all their stuff, symbolism and that kind of thing, trying to convey it in a meaningful way. So I may have already said, just picking any book you like and attempting, an adaptation is a perfectly fine way to get screenwriting experience. Again, I don't use the software because just hitting the space bar a few times and hitting enter a few times is not like that challenging. I don't necessarily worry about having everything centered and moved into the correct spot in the first draft. You can always, take it and enter it into a screenwriting software program and it'll fix some of that for you already. But if you are going to do this and take your favorite book and try and make it into a movie for your own benefit, don't try to shop that work around for money if you haven't secured any licensing rights to the manuscript. And be careful when you show it to if you know any industry people who might take it the wrong way, for whatever reason, instead of it's just a sample of your writing ability. If they're looking for someone to hire for a project, they might think, okay, this guy knows how to do this, or gal, or whatever. But on the other hand, if they're weird or paranoid, they might go, oh no, you stole somebody's book. Like, no, you weren't, trying to steal their intellectual property. You were just using it as a teaching tool, But yeah, don't submit something like that with a query cold, probably ever. It would have to be if they said, do you have any examples of your work? And you said, well, I have this thing I did, because I don't know how all that works exactly, but most of the stuff produced today seems to just be a rehash of old existing stuff anyway, but them's the breaks. I would suggest, a less effective maybe strategy to try rewriting a film from memory or something like that as a beginner exercise. But or maybe if you have some twist on the thing and you want to do it for kicks, like you know how Top Gun should have ended the first time back in '86 or whatever. Okay, fine. But there's that. But again, this would not be a true adaptation in the strictest sense of the making a book into a film or whatever. So we're kind of going a little off tangent here, but if you're just looking for writing, idea exercises, and you think you remember the movie pretty well, then yeah, you can do it that way and just trying to get familiar with the screenwriting formatting. Any strategy you pick, again, before you attempt your first real one, and blah blah blah, any kind of experience with the granular ways of the thing, how it fits together, how it moves, that kind of thing, I'd say is not bad skills to attain. Just you don't have to do the whole 120 pages to get a little practice doing that kind of thing. You can do a chunk, yeah. And as far as doing something that's already been done, there's already 3 versions of Wuthering Heights and 4 versions of Little Women or something. So, again, it's not like Hollywood is so original that your version of Little Mermaid might not get made because there's already been 2, right? But again, don't try and shop it around unless somebody asks or whatever. I may have mentioned that before as well, but at least it's it's just a couple minutes out of your day here, and I'm not reposting the same content every few months with a different thumbnail because I don't have any new or useful information, right? Okay, so hopefully that was somewhat useful. Again, I can't tell you how to, or I can't tell you what to write. I can only tell you kind of how to write, right? So this is kind of going in a little bit of a left turn from adaptation and outlining and everything else, but it still relates to the drafting and the draft, the initial writing, maybe to a degree, but probably a little farther down in the process for certain things. So as I had talked about in some of the Prose videos recently, where a lot of these how-to content creators don't give you a good sense of what should be in the drafting stage, what should be in the writing stage, what should be in the revising stage, and then the stages after that, publication and all that kind of thing. This, I'm a little bit, like I said, I'm trying to keep this kind of in the outline to draft stage. What work are we selecting? How are we adapting it? How are we going about adapting it? That kind of thing. Here, we want to talk a little bit more about, again, the actors and the writers are being slightly different. You have different audiences for who's reading your stuff at different stages, kind of. Because this initial script that you're trying to sell is more for the producer, right? Or maybe even the director. It's more for the studio. How the actor perceives it and what they want to change is typically out of your control. So try not to keep that in your head while you're writing it, that, oh God, I'm doing the beautifulest, most bestest dialogue ever, and this idiot's going to come along and mess it all up. Well, you can't do anything about that, okay? Unless you're the director. So the writer's job then is to take into consideration realistic budget concerns and, the cost of painful or dangerous stunts or special effects and things, or the size of the cast, how much that's going to cost. I'm not saying never to write these things in. even if you're doing a low budget movie, or that as an amateur that you will know the actual cost of, how much helicopter shots cost or car chases and all that. But I mean that if you know the film has a low budget, then don't be too surprised if none of that makes it into the film. Or if you know you're writing it for a low budget, then leave it out altogether and find another way to tell the story or tell a different story. So like one of the, even before I had the idea for doing this video, I was just thinking about this off the top of my head for no reason. That scene in Better Off Dead where, gee, I'm real sorry your mom blew up, Ricky, was probably a pretty expensive scene for a mostly lower budget film. I'm assuming it was a pretty low budget film-ish compared to Rambo, I guess, maybe. But that was also a writer-director situation, and instead of you just trying to sell something cold, I guess. So somehow he got that approved when he pitched the film. I assume that they knew there was going to be, special effects and that kind of thing in this movie. But in Better Off Dead, we see the explosion instead of having, like, say, a direct cut to the car the next morning, where that is the next bit of the action. Gee, I'm real sorry your mom blew up, Ricky, is a direct cut, but there could have been a different way. I mean, it could have been she lights the lighter and then instead of the explosion, we see a shot of an ambulance going, to a hospital or them all in the hospital or something instead of just the front of the house blowing up. And obviously this would have been less funny, but this, again, the special effect was more expensive than if you had a static shot of an ambulance pulling up to a hospital. So, again, this expense became the producer's problem when they okayed it, good to go. Okay. They didn't insist on, that change, even though the movie then made meh kind of money. I mean, we're not talking bomb in terms of Snow White bomb. I did a couple videos about that a few months ago already. And all those predictions mostly came true, right? So that was a really expensive mistake. But you as the writer saying there's 7 dwarves, well, yeah, the cast calls for 7 dwarves. How the studio attempts to go about making the 7 dwarves and CGIing over the other 7 dwarves to make those the 7 bandits and all that junk, that's them incurring costs that wasn't your fault. So your cast of 7 didn't automatically mean zillions of dollars in CGI and reshoots. So there you go. But again, if your original Snow White script called for the 7 dwarves to all be aliens who can fly or something, that might have complicated using live action people, because now the people have to fly, which people don't do. So that means green screening and blah, 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 and blah. And so that can get expensive, even when you thought it was something kind of simple. So anyway, so let's not stay on that all day. But nowadays, some TV shows will include some cheesy CGI effects that might cost more than they're worth, but it's still less danger to stunt people, etc. Although it puts their stuntman out of work for a week, maybe. I don't know. So there's give and take there. Again, as the writer, I guess you can shoot for the moon and include whatever elements you think will sell, but again, don't expect them to all make the final feature or whatever if it's not going to be in the producer's interest to budget for that or whatever. But obviously a sci-fi or a fantasy genre will need certain effects more than a standard drama or rom-com, etc. So if they're opting your fantasy and they're trying to make it as boring as possible, hey, instead of a dragon, why don't we have hamsters? Then, I don't know, cash the check and go on to the next one, or tell them to, come back when they're serious, I guess. Again, yes, fantasy should have some amount of better than Snow White bought at the thrift store costumes and that kind of thing. Or what's that? Pop up the Halloween store. We got all our costumes at the Hobby Lobby. Right. Okay, great. Some physical comedies, of course, will be more than just 2 people talking too and all that. I mean, Harry and Sally was kind of a great movie in terms of there wasn't a lot of action and yet people still loved their interplay and thing. But how many others can you name that are really, at that level where there's just two people discussing their relationship? There's like 3 or 4 with Meg Ryan, and that's that's kind of the pinnacle. The rest are usually a little more, full of hijinks or whatever. So then what I was saying before, dealing with the actors, that's more of the director's problem. They have to kind of process all the actors' weird issues and their motivations and this and that. But the director's trying to explain your script to the actor. Well, what is my motivation? Well, anybody should be able to kind of figure that out from reading the script anyway. If you haven't conveyed that correctly, you have slightly done something wrong. But again, your initial focus is to get this sold, not necessarily worry about how the director is going to tell the actor to interpret it, because the director might think the character's motivation is slightly different than the motivation that you clearly laid out, because they have some idea that the character has this haunted past, so he has sinister motives all of a sudden, or some weird thing that you were like, no, that's not what I meant. But again, it might make the film better, might make the film worse, but it's out of your hands kind of at that point. Yeah, and I've found in college that those camera geeks make lousy directors. They might make an okay director of photography, but they typically make a lousy director because they can't relate to actors on common, and find some common ground with them other than the framing is this, the camera does that, again, not really your problem as the writer. And I've discussed that a bit already. So I think that kind of covers everything. If I was a little vague about something or something you need kind of explained better or whatever, of course, leave a question in the comments and I'll see if there's some better way to convey that. But overall, like I said, we're kind of covering a lot of ground here, not all directly related to adaptation. Some of it just related to writing, some of it related to outlining. But like I said, rather than just make a bunch of little videos, I'd rather just do one and be done, and you can watch it in chunks or whatever. You don't have to sit here for 40 minutes to get the gist of each part. You can watch, 15 minutes of each and be fine or whatever. So yeah, that's about it. And we'll see what happens in the next one.